Dear friends, hello and welcome to another episode of Strategy International Podcast, the podcast that is produced for Strategy International, a global think tank and consulting firm that brings together great minds from all over the world to discuss, analyze, exchange on various issues of global interest, such as international policy, diplomacy, strategy and defense, economy, the environment, technology, and much, much, much more. Of course, for all that information, you can head on over to strategyinternational.org, where you'll find a wealth of information. Speaking of great minds, we have another great guest today on the show, Dr. Andrew Liaropoulos. He's an assistant professor at the University of Piraeus at the Department of International and European Studies. He also teaches in the Air Staff Command College, and his interests include international security, intelligence reform, strategy, foreign policy analysis, European security policy, cybersecurity, and Greek security policy. We're going to have a great conversation today. Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show.
Hello, George. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and happy to share my thoughts on cyberspace, cybersecurity, and many other topics.
Yeah, go ahead.
As you mentioned in the short introduction, I mainly focused the last year my research on topics that are related to cyberspace. My background is obviously on international politics, international relations. So basically what I try to do is apply all the theories and the concepts we have, let's say, from the traditional international politics and traditional, let's say, strategic thought in cyberspace. So the last years I've been, doing research and publishing on various topics on cyber governance, cybersecurity, digital electoral interference, digital surveillance, digital sovereignty, many other topics. So I'm happy to be here, and any questions, comments are more than welcome, obviously.
This is why I was interested, because when we exchanged, obviously in preparation for this podcast, and you told me, look, my specialization is international affairs, international politics, but I'm focusing on cyberspace, and I found that super interesting because it's the global happening, right? It's something that has, it hasn't been around for too long, and whether we like it or not, every single government all over the world has to face the reality that either there's a threat or there's an advantage to being on cyberspace, and to make policy around that issue. And I find it fascinating that you've figured out a way to merge both those things. Let's get started. Can you just explain this concept of cyberspace as a domain of, this geopolitical antagonism for all these powers globally?
Yes. To make a very short academic note, there is a new, academic field, cyber studies in general. So this is the area that many political scientists, even people with background on law and IT, are trying to explore. So this is my approach as well. So to start with cyberspace, we call it nowadays, as the new domain, the so-called fifth domain. So we look conventionally on all the other domains, land, sea, air, space. So the fifth, the new, let's say, domain is cyberspace. Basically, the easiest way to understand this is to think it not only as the conventional, let's say, internet, but basically as all the computer networks, all the computer systems that are related to what we have, let's say, a simple conversation regarding or exchanging emails through internet. So basically, a very simple, a way to understand this is saying that it's the network of networks. It connects and people all over the world. We transfer data, we transfer our ideas, our economy, and many other things. So it's, especially the last 2 decades, it's a new domain that all the actors, state and non-state actors, obviously compete. That makes perfect sense, because always states used to compete in all the other domains. What is kind of, I think, unique and interesting in this case is that it's a domain, of course, that is complex. It's a domain that is always expanding. If you look at the other domains, okay, you can see land, you can measure it. Obviously, there are borders, there are lines, there are certain things regarding jurisdiction and sovereignty. But if you think of cyberspace, it's always getting bigger because it's actually about data. So the more data we produce, the more things we put on Internet of Things. It's like a balloon that is always expanding and expanding and expanding.
Right.
And this is the challenge because it's not, let's say, something static. It's actually quite dynamic as a domain, as an arena of politics and geopolitics, and of course, an antagonism. Another issue is that, let's say, in conventional terms, we think of states and exercising state sovereignty. But really, if you think about it, most of the, let's say, part of the internet and cyberspace belongs to the private sector. So you have a big player there that you have to take into account when you're trying to regulate everything, think about security as well. So if you want to put some, let's say, ideas about cyberspace and antagonism, we have to think that there is, let's say, a technological angle that states want to compete about digital technology. So there are many areas. I mean, we cannot get into details on that, whether that is quantum computing, whether it's obviously artificial intelligence, whether it's emerging disrupting technologies. So always state used to compete about technology. So this is just, the latest, let's say version. But in a way, the scary thing is that we do not know yet the impact of this. These things are developing so rapidly that we cannot, let's say, project in 10 years from now how things going to be, for example, in terms of artificial intelligence. So if you take a scholar on governance, he would, let's say, discuss many ideas about global governance, but suddenly you have algorithmic governance tomorrow. So how can you really write a new law or think in terms of politics and security, one step forward, because technology is running faster than us. So there is a technological angle, and there is, if you want to explore a bit on this more, there's an antagonism also in terms of governance of cyberspace.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes into a lot of things. I would say that there are two conflicting ways of seeing the world and of seeing cyberspace. There is a division in a way between, if we call them, let's say, digital democracies and more, let's say, digital authoritarian states. So one group of states that obviously have a more democratic and liberal background, they think that they should, let's say, govern internet and cyberspace through the so-called multi-stakeholders, through the multi-stakeholder governance model. That means in any, let's say, international forum and organization, you have states, but also non-state actors, meaning the private sector, and obviously groups from the civil society. So this is, as you understand, a more open way of trying to regulate all those new things. And the rationale behind this approach is that cyberspace, up to a point, it encapsulates globalization. You cannot only have states. You should have other players as well. That's why we call it multi-stakeholderism. And those players are obviously the private sector and the civil society up to a point. On the other hand, we have the less democratic or more authoritarian states out there, which see this technology and this infrastructure and this domain as also a threat because they feel threatened by this. If we go back to the Arab Spring, it's a very good example of how these states were frightened about how somebody could utilize the information communication technologies in terms of social upheaval and uprising. If you remember the so-called Facebook or Twitter revolution back then. So the idea was, we have, let's say, a mechanism that we can use in our advantage to control society, control our citizens, exercise our power, and of course, galvanize whatever our regimes and our ideas. So this is the second way that looks in a way of a more traditional multilateral governance. So there you only have states, or even if you have other players, basically it's about states. It's more in a more, let's say, traditional Westphalian point of view that states should have the first and the final saying in how we govern these things, and we should not allow other players to get involved. This approach looks more, into let's say, security, national cybersecurity issues, obviously, and there is an idea that cyberspace is not borderless, so we should, in a way, construct virtual whatever borders. So how do we exercise sovereignty? How do we exercise our control? So in the first case, you would see more, liberal states, democracies, mainly speaking in the West, obviously, the US, European Union, many other countries. And the second, group of states, there are many states. I just, mentioned a few, like Russia, obviously, China, North Korea, Iran, but also states in some states in Asia and Africa that have a more, let's say, authoritarian approach on many things, including the governance of cyberspace.
Right. Tell me something. You mentioned before about how countries need, different governments, of course, need to start adapting quickly to this. And we're talking about antagonism, and historically, when it comes to national security or in general the way that countries behave, it's a long process. So when we're talking about these global partnerships all over the world, you kind of get to understand how certain countries and certain governments tend to grow and tend to react, and you can kind of project maybe 5-10 years in the future and to kind of position yourself accordingly. In this case, because everything is happening online and there seems to be very little control, how has cyberspace changed, the traditional understanding of national security and perhaps even warfare?
It has a major impact. As I mentioned earlier, first of all, in terms of both governance and security, we have to take into account seriously the private sector. So if you just define the concept of the national critical infrastructure, in some cases you can say, not many actual cases, you can say it's all, let's say, state-owned and regulated. But in many other cases, because of privatization, we have privatized a lot of things, even things, the banking sector, the energy sector, many other sectors that are private. So it's a case where you have, to coordinate with the private sector, public-private partnership, in order to regulate things about your national security. So this is a tricky thing because you can think of states that theoretically have a strong private sector, basically it's state-owned. So like China, for example, and other cases, other states that have a big private sector, and they have different systems of regulation. So that is one thing that you have to consider of how you bring the private sector in. The other way of discussing, if I will leave warfare in a while, but if we think about security, it's a very tricky, I would say, term to use in the cyber context, because in traditional security studies, there's always the question, how do you define security? To secure, to safeguard what? So if you look about cybersecurity, information security, data security, and many other terms, I'm not going to go into all the terminology now. You have to think of what is that we actually want to secure, to safeguard. Is it, let's say, just the critical information infrastructure, but in terms of, let's say, national cybersecurity? Or is it also other things, like do we also want to protect, to safeguard values, democracy, privacy, anonymity? So on one hand, you can have a more, let's say, state-centric, approach towards security and think that, I want to, let's say, protect my infrastructure. But another approach obviously is a more, let's say, human-centric one. I also want to protect the users of this infrastructure. So you, me, my privacy, our data. So you have two, let's say, conflicting approaches. How do you want to go? How do you gonna balance, between, let's say, protecting infrastructure, the telecommunication infrastructure, but also the way users, its users and regarding its data. So there are cases, there are very strict ways of, we have to protect you and the infrastructure, and we need your data for your safety, for national security, obviously concerns. And the other way that is, trying to balance between certain values and another system.
Right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, just because you mentioned war earlier. Now, if we go to war, strictly speaking, I would say, and the majority of the scholars actually agree on that, we do not have a classic, let's say, cyber war. So, of course, we have, using cyberspace, cyber attacks in terms of both peacetime and wartime, but we don't have, a strict, let's say, whatever case of cyber war. So, obviously, cyber attacks are used in many conflicts, And the tricky thing is because of the attribution problem, you cannot really pinpoint and say, he did it, she did it, this country, this state or non-state actor. So it's another tricky thing with cybersecurity in general and cyber war in particular, because in conventional warfare, let's say, you can more or less identify the attacker. And since you can identify the attacker, you can also work on deterrence, on many other things. But if I cannot prove that, I don't know, Mexico did a cyber attack on Canada yesterday, how can I, do deterrence by denial, deterrence by punishment, and all those things? So this is how we, in a way, leave the concept of having, a super, whatever, a total protective system, and we go to resilience. And I mean resilience in general and cyber resilience in particular as a new concept. So you have to live with the idea that, you cannot be 100% protected. You do not have a perfect, let's say, cyber shield to protect you, but you must have a resilient system, to be after an attack or after some hours effective, to go and function again as a state.
Right. But this goes back to the concept of governance that you were talking about earlier. How do we manage that? I mean, we know there are concepts of international law. There are institutions in place that govern relations between nations, and now you have this new reality. And you were talking about, the two camps that you can be in. Do we adopt it fully, or do we implement certain restrictions? And in the case, for example, that you gave between Mexico and Canada, obviously a very hypothetical example.
Yes.
What happens in that case? How do you, what are the legal structures that are getting involved in this new reality? And at the same time, let's not forget that you have, for example, situations where there are confederations, or, for example, the EU. So, I mean, in addition to having to deal in a state-by-state relationship, you also have a situation now where, for example, in Europe, you have to deal with the entire institution. So how do we manage that? Or is there anything in play as we speak, or is this kind of a direction that governments are currently looking into?
Okay. The shortest answer is, it's under construction. There is a saying that, global cyberspace, governance of cyberspace is still under construction for, I don't know, like 20 years or so.
Oh, yeah.
So I think it's still going to be valid in 10 or 20 years. Okay, I mean, let's get some ideas here. First of all, there is a lack and a gap in terms of for international/global governance of cyberspace. We do not have a, let's say, global treaty that pretty much regulates everything. The only thing that, let's say, we have regulated so far is things that have to do with cybersecurity, but more or less, with pornography, child pornography, and internet stuff like that. So it's a place where, in cybercrime, up to a point that more or less everybody agrees. When we go about cybersecurity, cyber war, and actually exercising sovereignty and all these things, states have not come up to a final solution so far. There is an ongoing, actually 20-25 years, if I'm not mistaken, a discussion in the UN, the governmental group of experts. Every 4 or 5 years, there is a statement about how can we build norms in order to regulate steadily all these things. So we are not close to having, let's say, an agreement. In terms of having, let's say, an international treaty. All that we are doing, and I can criticize that, is building norms. So norms is a nice thing. It's like the first step. You need norms. We cannot do magic from one day to another. But it's really hard to see if somebody actually follows those norms, if actually somebody is giving you enough data to prove that he's cooperating with you or not. I'm being very critical now, but you can just say unfortunately,
but it's very important, because I mean, understanding, and maybe you can discuss this. I mean, it's related. I mean, the challenges in achieving consensus on these cyber norms and these rules, among the different countries and stakeholders. Where are we with that?
Yes, well, as I said, we are still trying. If I put it in another way, and I hope it doesn't happen, sometimes you need a big event to force us to agree. and let's say obviously these are the norms we agreed. We have to do it right now to really establish a regime. So maybe, I'm just saying maybe, and I don't hope this, if we had a major incident, a kind of cyber conflict or something that really demonstrates the need to go a step further, then maybe, if we had a big cyber attack, a kind of, let's say, a cyber war, maybe that would trigger and force us, to build this consensus. There are many legal and not legal, let's say, discussions, political strategic discussions about, the NATO's Article 5, in terms of, how do we go to cyber war? How do we do this? How do we do that? Also, in terms of how can you define an armed attacks in cyber and digital terms? In conventional law, you have armed attack that it produces some violence. You kill people, you destroy something up to a point. You have the kinetic attack approach. But in the cyber, in the digital context, it's not that clear. Because I can do a cyber attack, but nobody might get killed. So is it a form of armed attack or not? There are states and organizations that say, we have to use this the similar approach, that if if you deny me the capabilities, whether it's from a kinetic attack or a cyber attack, it's the same thing. But in a way, I would challenge this discussion, saying that I find it really hard that somebody will declare war because of a cyber attack. And let's say that somebody state A gets attacked. You have to think of whether the state A wants to make this public or not. Because as part of a cyber attack, you can say, okay, something didn't work yesterday in my infrastructure. I can say, okay, we had a problem. It's not that country B actually attacked me,
Right.
And you have to think, does actually somebody want to do this? Because if you say this, then the public opinion say, how will we react? Sanctions, a cyber attack, or something like that. So there are many cases out there, in things that you call cyber crime, cyber terrorism, cyber security, cyber warfare. Of course, many states and state sectors are being attacked every day, cyber attacked, but nobody really goes out in public and says it, because politically, then with a political attribution, you have to deal with it.
Right.
So we don't have a clear, let's say, picture in terms of numbers, in terms of statistics of the volume of cyber attack that goes out there every day.
A question for you, Andrew, because we're mentioning before how the two different positions that countries can be in, and how more often than not in one position you have more authoritarian countries, and I don't know the numbers, perhaps you do. It definitely seems that way, though, from everything that we're seeing, that these more authoritarian countries seem to be a bit more advanced when it comes to their their cyberspace kind of control, and whether it's cyber attacks or what have you. We think of Russia, we think of China, and maybe I'm off. Maybe other countries have advanced policy on countering or on having their own cyberspace policy. But it seems to me that there are countries that are maybe a couple steps ahead. So while the international community is thinking of values and norms, and you mentioned like 20 years now, it's been discussed at the UN, and you have other countries that have fully taken advantage of this technology and of the advances that are happening almost exponentially. Do they have an edge over the other countries that are maybe more Western countries or more law-abiding countries?
Okay, good question. I mean, let me just clarify something. In general, cyberspace is a domain that favors the offense. So,
right.
It's easier for somebody to attack. It's value for money just to do a cyber attack, and it's really hard, as I mentioned earlier, the attribution. Another way to approach your question is how do we define cybersecurity? Only in terms of cyber attacks, or also in terms of using cyberspace, social media platforms, in order to manipulate, to do social engineering, to control society in general? So yes, obviously, as you and I'm sure everybody in the audience can more or less understand, in terms of authoritarianism, you have a comparative advantage because you have a closed system. You have a system that is usually authoritarian. You want to control. You control the old media. You control now internet. You control the social media, and it's a way to exercise some sort, let's say, of domestic control. You do not have a real opposition. You can manipulate public opinion. So that gives you to a point, a comparative advantage in terms of domestic politics. In terms of, let's say, let's say cyber offensive, whatever capabilities, I cannot really answer the question because it's quite technical, and we can only answer this sort of questions from open sources. But from, let's say, 20 years, let's say, of experience and open source information, we see until now that, let's say, the cyber option is rarely a unique option or a game changer. It's one of the many options. So yes, it's one of the domains, it's one of the fields that everybody's going to use, but more or less, depending on the conflict, depending on the participants in every conflict and warfare, it's one of the many options. You still have, the brutal conventional ways of doing conflicts, of killing people, of bombing and stuff like that. But the other angle, which is not in a way that often highlighted, is if you think of cyberspace and, as I said, cybersecurity in terms of more, let's say, socio-political terms and less of military technical ones. So, of course, in every conflict, war, there is a battle about, the public opinion, about the truth, about, shaping the public opinion, about gaining the consensus. So this is an area that pretty much, as I said earlier, we have to think of whether it's something that attacks also our values. Which values? Of course, for somebody it could be, in terms of national security, I'm always right. So I want, to safeguard public opinion. These are ideas, and I'm not criticizing, I'm just explaining these ideas that are explode obviously in Russia, China, and many other states. If you look at Russia, and it's an interesting example also because of the wars in Ukraine. Since 2016, they had their national information security doctrine. And they said in 2016 that we want to have, as they said, a clean internet. Clean meaning not having others, in our, let's say, information, national information sphere, as they call it, as they label it, that obviously spread disinformation in their point of view.
Right.
And they had the approach of having the so-called RUNET, Russian network, which is a closed national network. And in 2016, remember, after Crimea and everything, they said that in case of an emergency could be anything, let's say a coup or a war or whatever, we should be able to, get the Russian internet disconnected from, let's say, the global internet. And that's what they did on March 2022, last year.
Right.
After the war, they said, we're not allowing all the others, whatever Western / American social media companies and in general to operate in Russia. We control the infosphere. We control the data centers that are based in Russia, in Russian territory, not abroad. So this is one dimension of, of how, if you think of domestic politics and, regime change or not, that is very important. The other aspect of it is, about cyber attacks or not.
Speaking of China, there's a lot of talk, and there's very little information, and we don't know if it's actually true or not. This concept of this Chinese social credit that is being spoken about, and we're talking about societal norms. How has Chinese digital authoritarianism evolved in recent years? And it seems to me that it's completely disconnected from anything, at least that we're living here in Canada, where I'm from.
Yes, it has evolved in a rapid way. And I would say, if you think of how should I say it, a digital version of George Orwell, a digital version of Panopticon, you can find it in China, unfortunately. So China was whatever, more or less a closed system. Okay. So, during the Cold War, even in post-Cold War, in terms less closed, but still close. It's part of their culture in a way to be a closed system. So what they understood, especially after, as I said earlier, the Arab Spring, that, this is a threat, but also there is an opportunity. It's a threat if you have, whatever, cold revolution tomorrow morning in Beijing, and you have, Chinese people saying, we want to change everything. But it's also an opportunity, a useful tool to have, as they say in terms of Confucius, societal harmony. So this is the opportunity, to have societal harmony to actually be able to regulate how people think, how to censor and self-censor the Chinese citizens in terms of everything. So what they have done actually since 2016 is the idea of the so-called social credit system.
Mm-hmm.
It's a system that every Chinese citizen, it's not fully implemented right now until now, but it's expanding in both state and actually in the private sector. So what they said is every citizen has, let's say, a digital number, like a social security number, so a digital number, and also an application in the mobile, right? So everything you do in terms of digital terms, in terms of cyberspace, is valued, and you receive credits and a low score or a higher score. So I'll just give you some examples. So if you go on a social media platform and criticize the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, obviously you will receive a low score, and you will see it on your mobile saying that you lost 10 points, for example.
Wow.
Uh, yes, if there is a public demonstration criticizing, I don't know, the Uyghurs, the Tibet whatever relationship, or the Taiwan whatever relationship, and you participate either online or physically, again you will receive a low score. But there are practical implications of that. So if you go with a low score and you go to the bank and you ask for a loan, I'll say, oh, unfortunately, George has a higher score than Andrew, so we will choose to give the money to George. Okay, you can not work in the public sector,
Right.
and you are the worst case scenario, of course, that you go to jail. Okay, but there are restrictions regarding that you cannot leave the country, because if you want to book a ticket, you have to do it through this number. So once you put, on the website this ticket, this number, it says, we're not going to allow you to give you an air ticket. You cannot even leave the province that you are. So you're in a way a prisoner in your own whatever territory there. So it's a way to do, in a grand scale, social engineering. This is, a very, I mean, if you ask me, very Orwellian way of utilizing this technology.
No doubt, no doubt. And I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking, is there any advantage to having something like this? And the only thing that keeps coming to my head is obviously no. I mean, what a really authoritarian way of controlling your population.
Yes,
It's
but
incredible.
let me add another angle. I mentioned China, and yeah, the first that have implemented that. But if you look closer, if you look on what China is doing in other areas because of the digital Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. So there is a digital version on that as well. So what are the Chinese saying in countries in East Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa? They say, we will build all the digital infrastructure for you. Don't go to the West and go to the US or the EU. Will build it, cheaper or whatever, or we don't care about other regulations. And we will also offer you, a form, of digital authoritarianism, both infrastructure, the CCTV cameras, but also the regulations. So if you not think of in terms of Canada, which is a nice democracy, liberal state, if you think of in terms of, other places in the world that are, not that democratic or a bit semi-authoritarian, they are going for the Chinese option. And if you look at the big picture, we think of internet the way it started. It was obviously a US project. It was very liberal, very democratic, the nature of it, of being an open system. But if you think in 10 whatever years from now, and you think that there are 8 billions tomorrow morning, and most of those people are in states that do not have a very genuine liberal understanding of certain things, and they might think it's right for the state whatever to regulate everything, to control me and control my data and control whatever my privacy. So this is a scary concept of how things might be, even in terms of if you want to make an international treaty in 10 years from now and say, how do we regulate data privacy? I'm sure that both of us, would fancy the more liberal Western approach, but maybe that does not apply to, the majority of the states out there. So this is why we might have, like small, how should I say it, groups of states like the EU or other cases where we have, different models, different approaches. The EU is an interesting case. You mentioned the European Union earlier. In the European Union, it's a unit actor. I mean, it's an organization, but it's small and in the government organization, and they are discussing the last 4 or 5 years about the idea of digital sovereignty. So it's an interesting discussion, because if you think of sovereignty, you always define it in terms of a state. So can the EU have sovereignty? It's not a state.
Right.
But what's the rationale behind this discussion? The Europeans obviously realized that they're weak in many terms, in digital terms. To be very hard on that, there is a saying that the EU is a digital colony, because if you look at the digital market, if you look at artificial intelligence, if you look at data infrastructure, 5G, cloud data, etc., it's either the US or the Chinese that are dominant. We as the European Union, we buy from either the US or China. So it started as a discussion, we are weak in a way, and we have to think of how, to become more autonomous. Again, a discussion about EU strategic autonomy, but also in digital terms. So it's interesting, because any conventional discussion about sovereignty in EU would raise eyebrows. Well, what is this? It's national sovereignty.
Right.
We still have states, nation states, whatever. But in terms of digital, it's interesting because the EU has realized its weaknesses. It's the first step. The other thing is, if you look at the EU, we're not going to go, let's say, towards the Chinese, let's say, model. And in a way, the EU does not really fancy, if I might say, the US model, because that's of data capitalism. We are more sensitive in terms of, some things about how data regulation,
Right.
privacy, anonymity. Think of the idea of the GDPR. So we are somewhere in the middle, in terms of we are not close to, let's say, data capitalism that the US has as a model. Of course, not the digital authoritarian one that the Chinese have. And there we had the idea of the so-called Brussels effect. So how can EU in a way project digital power in soft terms, that everybody likes GDPR, or it's a regulation that up to a point we can enforce to other states out there. So we lose something in terms of infrastructure, obviously, but we gain something in terms of influence. So as I said, this is a very complex and dynamic way of seeing different conceptions, different perceptions of how we can take advantage of regulations, of technology, and of things to happen in the near future.
With with a very quick development of AI and quantum computing, what kind of impact does that have on the global cyberspace landscape? Well, what role does it already have, or will it have in the future?
It's really an interesting and difficult question to answer. First of all, as I said earlier, it's very dynamic. It's something that we have not seen the end of it. I mean, we cannot right now imagine the full spectrum of implications of artificial intelligence. We have seen only, let's say, a part of it. Again, I cannot say if it's a small or the half of it or whatever. There is an obvious implication in the global market, in how you produce wealth, right? And there is also an implication about how you can use this in terms of security and warfare. If you look at the case of Ukraine, which is it's a good example. It's like a laboratory right now for the utility the application of artificial intelligence. You can use it in cryptography, cryptanalysis. You can use it in terms of open source code. You can use it in terms of identifying a person in a picture from a social media platform. Or is this actually Andrew, or is it somebody else that has
Right.
changed the characteristics? In deep fake videos, in face recognition, applications. So I'm sure it's going to have a huge impact. What I am, if I might say, a bit worried about is the human aspect of it. We have always seen technology through history changing, the social structures, the social ecosystem, the way we produce wealth, we fight. From gunpowder to nuclear weapons. Okay, but with artificial intelligence and many other implications, the human element, the human part is, it's the tricky thing, because up to a point dehumanizing many things. And that's the scary thing, because in artificial intelligence, it's not that, let's say, a machine will just press the button, fire, but it would also make the decision.
Its own decisions, yeah.
So you lose the ethics and the humanity of it. As I said, in one term, you're just dehumanizing it. And I cannot speak in technical terms because I'm not an expert on that, whether that can happen easily or not, because it's still under developing the machine learning. And but in a scary whatever scenario and project, you can think of machines taking over and building, constructing their own understanding and ethic, and that might be different to the human, let's say, understanding. So in a way, you will have another civilization on Earth, to put it very, very frankly. And we have to, in a way, compete or fight or coexist with machines and artificial intelligence tomorrow morning.
It's quite fascinating. You spoke before when we first started about the centralizing or decentralizing, the internet infrastructure. What are some risks or benefits of having a more decentralized structure?
There is the tendency, if I had to predict, to go to defragmentation. The original and, let's say, romantic idea of having one common whatever internet cyberspace that would unite the whole world, and it's the idea of globalization. If we look at how things are developing, I don't think it's going to be here for many more years. States or regions, are going to the idea that we should develop our own understanding and our own infrastructure. In a way, it's the opposite way. It's an example of deglobalization, if you want.
Right.
If you look at, there are cases, in a way, small cases, like North Korea, Russia, and Iran, in a way, that have gone towards this option. This might not be a popular option, and you're losing a lot of things in terms of global commerce, stuff like that. But you can have regional, like if African or through ASEAN or through the European Union, regional smaller, let's say, intranets, where certain states will regulate and combine certain sectors. Is it commerce? Is it freedom of speech? Is it something else? So I'm not very optimistic on having a global, united, and common cyberspace in the near future. It's gonna be fragmented. And if you look back at history, it makes sense, because fortunately or unfortunately, we have competition, you have antagonism, and you're gonna have a class. Maybe after a class, things, we will change the cards again, and we will have a new structure, a new order. I cannot predict that. But the way things are going in terms of governance, in terms of warfare and security, it looks that we're going to have, a defragmented internet in the near future.
Right. I want to go back to the cyber deterrence that we were speaking about before. How much space do you think, or what role does this concept of cyber deterrence have in national security strategies or policy? How much do you think that concept, in terms of the different government policies, does it occupy in terms of percent? Do you think it's the main worry, or do you think it's one of the top priorities in constructing national security strategies?
There is how should I say it? Should I put it? A diplomatic and a more practical answer. So if we go to the more, let's say, diplomatic answer, every state, every cyber command, every Ministry of Defense, etc., would say we want cyber deterrence, we're working towards cyber deterrence, etc., etc. If you look in everyday practice, as I said earlier, we more or less know that it's hard to deter, effectively. You can deter by denial, which is difficult up to a way, depending on the states and the case of case, and you can deter by punishment. Okay, so I think that a well-known secret actually is that everybody is doing some sort of, you can label it as you want, cyber attacks, cyber operations. There are especially new approaches regarding active and passive defense in cyberspace. Very flexible terms to define in legal and not legal terms many things. So as I said, I think we have passed the way of actually doing deterrence, and we are in the way of building resilience, societal cyber resilience, and using offensive, defensive operations, active, passive, whatever defense, label it as you want it, to do our business in both peacetime and wartime. And with cyberspace and also hybrid warfare, I'm sure there's a gray area because it's not clear that this is peacetime, this is wartime. Like you don't change, you push a button, say today we start. Conventionally speaking, the wars. You do what you do. I mean, you penetrate computer systems, you collect information, you place your Trojan horses every day. That's a common practice, and you do not have the, let's say, conventional or nuclear understanding of only having deterrence and putting all your emphasis on that.
Right. Up until maybe 5, 6, maybe let's say if we push it 10 years ago, in my opinion, or the way that I always saw it, there was this clear dividing line between the private sector and government. Of course, they mingled. Obviously, one needs the other to coexist. But when it came to actually, the business of politics, it was rare to see, the private sector have such an active role, right? And it seems to me now, and going back to what you're saying, that private companies and these tech giants are taking much, much more space in terms of policy making and the influence they have on governance. What do you think, the role of the private companies and these tech giants should be in shaping cyberspace governance or behavior?
It's really important to think of the private sector, as I said earlier, as a stakeholder. You cannot imagine, let's say, a cyberspace, internet, and all these things, all these developments without the private sector, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Then the question is, how can you cooperate or regulate, depending on whether it's the US, the EU, or China, different approaches, obviously, of the private sector. In terms of, how should I put it, economy, in terms of everything, it's a data-driven system out there, in terms of economy, in terms of influence, in terms of warfare and security. So the majority of the actors that are involved in this are from the private sector. So you need, in a way, to strike a balance. It's scary, and I say scary in both democracies and non-democracies, to consider how powerful these technological giants are. I will give you, I'm not going to say names, but they are pretty much known. Think of a search engine. Anything that you want to look at, you just put the term in the search engine. So imagine that this search engine or any search engine more or less controls knowledge up to a point.
Right.
It's not that you're going to go to the library, conventional speaking library, open a book and look for something. You're going to look at there. So somebody has the power in a way to control data/knowledge up to a point. And there is an algorithm behind this of whether you're going to put this term and whether something will show up in the number 1 or number 100. Think of this. It's just this example of how powerful somebody is. Think of the social media platforms. They regulate. They control. The narratives. They shape the narratives. There are cases where the algorithm pretty much is is fixed in a way to offer us an alternative perception or not. But whether it's the US, China, Russia, or whatever, the EU, you have to think of how powerful those private sector is.
Definitely, but also all the information they have, right, on what we like, what we don't like. In the morning, what's the trend? At night, what's the trend? What do you like more? It's fascinating to me to know that there's a space where they have all this information.
Yes, and that the model of the economy model is based on data. So they say, of course, since it's free of charge to be in a social media platform, more or less, I'm going to take your data, have a profile of you as a customer, but also as a citizen, right? So, okay, maybe somebody knows from my search engines what I like, what I dislike, but you also know, politically speaking, ethnically speaking, racially speaking, sexually speaking, what are my preferences. So somebody could target me, micro targeting or social targeting in general,
Right.
and manipulate me up to the point. This is why I think that we need, and this is an optimistic and actually a wish, we need in the near future to construct a social contract, a digital social contract. So if you look in the past of the ideas of a social contract, you say, we have a state, a government that regulates. We as people, as society, we give, let's say, this authority to somebody to regulate more or less our lives. We need to do this again, but we are in a state of data. It's not just war, and we are in a state where boundaries are not fixed.
Right.
And we have to have in this calculation, fortunately or unfortunately, the private sector. There are cases where the private sector is more influential and powerful than small states.
Right. Right.
In terms of economic power, but also in terms of influencing. So we should, try to construct a new social contract and see how we can regulate the private sector for the benefit of all. But as I said earlier, up to a point, I know that it's an idea that is out there, but it's very difficult to apply it.
Absolutely. We're going to wrap it up, Andrew. Anything that you're working on right now, or anywhere where you want to direct all the listeners and viewers to kind of follow your work and the amazing stuff that you're doing?
Well, in this internet environment, anybody that Googles my name or put in any search engine, you can find my profile in Academia and ResearchGate in University of Piraeus. I upload all my publications because I like the idea of sharing, obviously, my thoughts, my research, and I'm looking forward for any feedback in LinkedIn and many other social media platforms that you can find me.
We're going to have everything in the description for anyone interested in following Andrew. Thank you so
Excellent.
much for the time that you took. Really, really, really appreciate it. I want to invite everyone to go to strategyinternational.org for any information. We're on all digital platforms, so there's really no excuse. So you have such a wealth of information available to you. Andrew, once again, thank you so much for the time. It's really appreciated.
Thank you, George. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.